Well, welcome back, all of you. It's good to see you again, and I hope that things went well this week. We had a little bit of a different reading situation this week. You spent most of the week in Isaiah, a very long book, and you got well into Jeremiah and not done yet, and that's also a long book. A little bit of a different situation with reading, so I hope you're able to stick with it. As we've gotten into the prophets now, remember what I reminded you of last week when we ended. The fact is that the prophets, like every other book in the Bible, is here to show us God. Not necessarily to show us the future, though certainly they have things to say about the future. Since they are trying to tell us about God, we want to be careful that we understand the message of the prophet. Lots of times when the prophets are talking about things that are yet to come, they don't know exactly how those things will come about. But even when that's the case, they know they have a message. And their message is often about God and what He expects and what He's like. And if we can key into the message of the prophet without trying to think ahead of them and think to the future and think about how that's all going to happen, we'll be getting what we really need to get from these books. The prophets arose in times of crisis. That's when God usually raised up a prophet in order to be His representative and His spokesperson. That's the prophet's job. The prophet's job is not to predict or to somehow be looking in a crystal ball to tell you what's going to happen. The prophet's job is to be the spokesperson for God. And it was in times of crisis that God brought these people out and gave them their commission and their ministry. Now, as we go through the prophets, we're going to have a little bit of time disorientation because we went through the narrative literature all the way through Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, and we worked through history. And remember, we got to what we called the post-exilic period, after the time of exile when the people came back, rebuilt the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah, and we even went into with Esther. All of those things had moved us all the way into the 5th century BC. Now with the prophets, we're kind of coming back in time and into some of those earlier time periods. So we're going to have a little bit of time disorientation. So for instance, Isaiah is prophesying, starts out about 740 BC. So we're back before the exile, before the temple was destroyed, all the way back in time, and we're in the middle of the kingdom period, kind of halfway between David and the fall of Jerusalem. So that's what we'll have to get used to as we're reading the prophets and talking about them together. The time of crisis for Isaiah was that the Assyrian Empire was beginning to become important, beginning to spread out its tentacles over the ancient Near East and to start incorporating other countries into its vast empire. That's the crisis when Isaiah comes onto the scene. The Assyrians are coming. The Assyrians have already started invading and conquering territory. And the question is, how are God's people going to respond? How are the kings going to respond? Remember, we talked about some of the kings were instruments, some of them were obstacles, some of them were willing to trust God, some of them were not. And so that's the question. The first king that we spend some time with in Isaiah is King Ahaz. Don't get him confused with Ahab. Ahab and Jezebel were a century earlier in the time of Elijah. Okay, we're now dealing with a king called Ahaz. Remember the blur of the kings when you read Kings and Chronicles? Here it is again. Anyway, Ahaz is faced with this difficulty, a military crisis. Assyrians on the horizon, other military flare-ups. How's he going to respond? God sends Isaiah to Ahaz with the message, trust the Lord. Trust God. Don't rely on Egypt. Don't rely on other countries. Don't try to do your own thing here. Trust God. Unfortunately, Ahaz didn't do very well with that. He decided on his own plots and schemes and plans, and they fell through, and there was trouble. That's the early part of the book of Isaiah, as you read through that. Then we get into the middle part of the book of Isaiah, and we've shifted kings. Now we're dealing with Hezekiah. Hezekiah is known as one of the reforming kings, one of the kings who did it right, one of the kings who did it well, who trusted God. And so in his crisis moment, he also was dealing with Assyrians, although it's some 40 years later. And in his crisis, he trusted God, he listened to Isaiah, and Jerusalem was miraculously delivered from the armies of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king. And so in Isaiah we get this contrast. Kings who do it wrong, kings who do it right. Kings who trust, kings who don't trust. And of course, what's the word to us? It's better to trust. It's better to rely on God. And so that message comes through in the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah. With Isaiah, we also get a lot of prophecies that deal with what kingship should really look like. In fact, Isaiah talks about an ideal king who is coming. This ideal king who is coming is going to rule the way a king should. He's going to reflect what God's kingship ought to be like. He's going to be the perfect representative of God's kingship. In time, this ideal king from David's line came to be referred to as Messiah. This one who would come and rule in God's name. And so, with Isaiah, we start to get this emphasis on this future ideal king of David's line. One of the first names that is given to this Messiah is Emmanuel. It's an important name. It means God with us. Think about that. Think about what we've been saying from the very beginning of our reading, of our sessions together. God's presence, God with us. This is a new stage of God's presence. God's presence in the temple is one thing, but now it's going to be God's presence in a person. God's presence in a person, Emmanuel. God is with us. Now, in the time of Isaiah, they did understand what all of that might mean. But of course, when you get to the New Testament, it's coming, you'll get there. When we get to the New Testament, Jesus is born, and he is Emmanuel, God with us. Now, God with us not just by being present in his temple, but God in the flesh. God who dwelt among his people in the form of a man. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. A new level of God's presence. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what's going on in Isaiah. This glimpse of what kingship is supposed to look like. Trusting kings, non-trusting kings, future kings. This is Isaiah. In Isaiah, he saw failure of kings. And he brings his words to the people. Words of, remember the four? Words of indictment, where he was telling the people and the kings what they were doing wrong. Words of judgment, the Assyrians are going to come, or God is going to bring punishment, or God is going to bring exile. Okay, words of judgment. Words of instruction. Turn to the Lord. Repent. He'll forgive. And then finally, words of aftermath, of hope, of deliverance. God has future plans for Israel. God's not done with you. Now remember, these words are spoken here in the 700s. And the exile, the destruction of Jerusalem and carried off into exile doesn't come until 586. A couple hundred years later. And you can imagine how those people in the exile would be able to look back on these words of Isaiah and find hope in them. God's not done. There is hope after the judgment comes. And so we have this idea of God's presence being spoken of in a new way, at a new level. and their ability to encounter God in a new way. When we move to Jeremiah, we're going to jump down a whole century from Isaiah, a whole century forward. Jeremiah comes in another crisis. When Jeremiah begins his prophetic ministry, the Assyrians are fading from the scene. Isaiah came at the beginning of the Assyrians. Jeremiah comes at the end of the Assyrians. It's interesting that at the time when Jeremiah is called by God to be a prophet, and that's recorded in that first chapter of Jeremiah. I know you haven't gotten all the way through Jeremiah yet. It's a long book, and that's going to continue next week. But you've gotten a little bit into it, and you've seen this idea that he's commissioned as a young man. He thinks he's too young to do this kind of job. And the situation into which he's called, the last great Assyrian king has just died. Now, of course, they don't know that he's the last great Assyrian king, but he is. The last great Assyrian king has just died. Josiah, who is the king in Judah at this time, in Jeremiah's homeland here, king in Jerusalem, Josiah has begun reforms. And the Babylonians have declared their independence from the Assyrians, whom they were under, and they have become a free state. We're in a transition then between the Assyrians on the way out, Babylonians on the way in, and a spiritual moment of reform. What's going to happen? Well, in Jeremiah we find that things are not going to go the right direction. The Babylonians are going to become the world power. The Babylonians are going to become the threat. Jeremiah's call is in the 620s BC, and the fall of Jerusalem is going to come in 586, a mere generation from Jeremiah's prophesying to the end. And so he warns them about a foe from the north, an enemy that's coming to destroy. But Jeremiah is already talking about the possibility that they could lose God's presence. And that's what I want to focus on. There's a section known as the Temple Sermon in Jeremiah chapter 7. And if you want to turn there, you can look through it with me. I'm only going to read a couple of verses of it. But in Jeremiah chapter 7, starting in about halfway through verse 2 there, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and don't shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your forefathers forever and ever. Notice the covenant theme coming back. This land that God had given them. Notice the theme of presence. God's presence. They're taking it for granted. They're trying to exploit it. They're trying to manipulate it. They're thinking that as long as God is dwelling there, nothing can go wrong. And God says, there's nothing magical about this. I live in your midst expecting you to be just people. And if you're not, I'll leave. See, that's what's hanging there in the balance. The fact that they again could lose God's presence. Now remember, that's exactly what happens within a generation. God leaves. And the city is destroyed. And the temple is destroyed. And the people lose their land. Many people die. So this idea of God's presence leaving, by the time you get to the end of Jeremiah, as you will this week, you'll make it, you'll do it. By the time you get the last chapter of Jeremiah, it's the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah lives through those final days when the people hear him but don't respond to him. And the city falls. And so we have this idea that God's presence is leaving. It's back to Eden again. It's back to the fall, back to the fruit, back to the sin, back to the disobedience. God's presence lost all over again. As we mentioned in Genesis when we said, the real problem of the fall was not losing paradise, it was losing God's presence. And it's the same thing here. It's not just a building that got knocked down, the temple. It was God's place of His presence, and they lost it because of their sin and unfaithfulness and disobedience. God had come into relationship with them through the covenant, and He asked them to follow the law, to be holy as He was holy, to be His people, because He wanted to bring blessing to the whole world through them by showing the world who He was and what He was like through them. What a privilege they had to be God's people. And instead, they disobeyed, they rebelled, they sinned, they went their own way, and it's so easy to do. It's our natural inclination to go our own way. And the privilege was lost because God's presence left. Now you're going to read more about that next week as you continue reading in Jeremiah, and you'll see a couple things. You'll see the idea that God's going to make a new covenant with them. Not like the old one which they broke, but a new covenant. And that new covenant is going to have certain rearrangements to it, which we'll talk about. And you're also going to read in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel sees this vision of God's presence leaving and trying to cope with this whole idea of the loss of God's presence. So we're going to finish up Jeremiah, we're going to read Ezekiel, we're going to read Daniel, and we'll get into the minor prophets a little bit as well next week. Again, as all these prophets come flowing through, remember what you're looking for. You're looking to understand the message of the prophet. Don't let yourself get too tied up in thinking about how all of this might be fulfilled in the future. Think about the message of the prophet. See, the prophets knew precisely what message they had for the people. They understood their message. And they expected the people to understand the message and respond to it, because that message had to do with God. This is the kind of God we serve. Now, this is important then for us to understand. Sometimes when we read some of this literature, the prophetic literature, or even when we read the historical literature or the laws, you might very well have the question, what does this mean to me? How is this applicable to my life? Where I live, the situations I face. Sometimes the Old Testament seems so distant from us, and we don't know what to do with it. And if we're looking to Scripture to try to explain to us how we ought to live today, tomorrow, next week, next month, sometimes we feel like, I don't get it, I don't see it. Let me reorient you a little bit. Going back to our premise, this is God's revelation of Himself. What we are expected to get from this literature is a knowledge of God. I would suggest to you that there is nothing more relevant or more applicable to your life than knowing God. When you ask, what am I supposed to get out of this? You are supposed to get a knowledge of God. And that knowledge of God should be something that you embrace and accept in your own heart, that will guide your living, that will guide your choices, that will guide who you are, what you are becoming. That knowledge of God has to get inside and change you. That's how this material is applicable to you. It is giving you a picture of God that should stick with you for your entire life, that should change how you live. Not because it's saying, make this choice, make that choice, do this, don't do that. But because in knowing God, you have a vision then of the kind of person you need to be. And if you know what kind of person you need to be, you'll make right choices. You'll do the right thing. You'll be holy. You'll be godly. As you continue reading the prophets, keep that in mind this week. And commit not only to reading the pages that you're assigned to read, but to think over and over again about how these pages are delivering to you this picture of God. Have a great week in God's Word, and we'll see you all next week.